Poverty is not just the absence of money, but the absence of opportunity. And the United States is a country where you have both freedom and abundant opportunities. Moving to the United States has given me both. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. I came from a close-knit family. I was the third of four children. And the best thing that my parents gave me was the gift of education. Even though I came from a poor family, they gave me education with the instruction that this is the tool that will help me to dig my way out of poverty and ignorance. But what my parents did was that they instilled in us the value of faith, hard work, and not giving up. They made us realize that if you put in the work, you will definitely get the reward. I came without a dime in my pocket. All I had was big dreams, determination to succeed, and the resilience. I got my first job at the age of 14. My job was on a construction site. My duties were to move concrete on a large pan from one end of the construction site to another one. I worked on that day from around 6 in the morning to about 7 at night. At the end of the day, the employer refused to pay me. And the reason was because she did not authorize the foreman to hire me. So I worked from sunup to sundown and didn't get paid. That tore up my spirit. And from that moment on, I decided that I was going to become a lawyer. And I was going to use every ounce of strength within me to fight against injustice, regardless of how powerful the opponent is. I am a man that worked my way up from nothing. I know what it means to feel like you're being unfairly treated, and I'm the person that can stand up to opponents regardless of how big or how powerful they are. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Legal Angle with Emmanuel Olawale. I have a guest with me today who is one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And I find it to be an honor to have to interview him. His name is Reynaldo Valencia. He is an attorney, he's a scholar, he's an author, he is the dean of my alma mater, Capital University Law School. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Valencia.
It is my great honor to be invited. Thank you.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. We seem to have similar backgrounds. I am a second generation American on my mother's side and a third generation on my father's side. I grew up in the Texas Panhandle. My grandmother on my mother's side it is said came over when she was 3 days old. So in those days, the border in Texas was very different. People passed back and forth in a very fluid fashion. But despite being either second or third generation, I grew up in a very Mexican American close knit family and area in Lubbock, Texas, which is in the Texas Panhandle. My mother had 13 brothers and sisters, and my father had 17 brothers and sisters. So they came from very large migrant farm working families, which are very common in Texas and the Mexican American community. And they met while their families were moving around the country doing migrant work. So my father married my mother, my father's brother married my mother's sister, and my father's cousin married my mom's third sister. So there was a lot of Anayas, which is my mother's maiden name, marrying Valencias. But at any rate, my parents dropped out of school to help support their large families. So my mom only went to the sixth grade, and my father only went to the third grade. So when we were being raised in Texas, by the time my sisters and I came along, my parents had stopped the migrant farm work they were doing as children when they were growing up. And my father was a construction worker, and my mother cleaned houses for a living. So instead of having those large families that they came from, all of my aunts and uncles, my dad's and my mom's brothers and sisters, had smaller families. They all had one or two kids. The most was 6. But I think that coming from an impoverished, large migrant farm working background, they all decided that they wanted to do things differently. So in my nuclear family, my mother and father had my older sister, myself, and my younger sister. So my older sister and like my cousins of that age were the first to graduate high school because none of my aunts and uncles, except one on my dad's side, had finished high school. No one on my mother's side finished high school. So as we were growing up, anything I did after the 6th grade, which is where my mom had dropped out, was something that my parents just did not understand or appreciate at all. They were very supportive of education, they just didn't understand it. So I remember being in high school and my mother coming in when I'm trying to study or something, and it's late at night, and she would turn off the lights to my room and she'd say, go to bed. They can't possibly give you more homework than you can do during the daytime, because she just didn't understand. But despite all that, I was always good in school, and I was student body president, and I was all these things. And I had some great counselors and teachers that guided me. And so I ended up graduating from Stanford University with my bachelor's and master's degree. And then I went on to Harvard Law School and got my law degree. I pretty much decided to be a lawyer. I'd always been interested since about high school. And then once I got going in college and got good grades, I knew that I could do it. So I ended up graduating and then going back to Texas to work for a big firm. And then 5 years after that, I decided to go into full-time teaching. I had been teaching as a part-time person and stayed at a school in San Antonio, Texas for 20 years, and then moved to a new school that we were starting in Dallas for the last 5 years. And then Capital came calling more than 2 years ago. So I've now just wrapped up my 2nd year of being dean here. So that's kind of a quick overview.
What an interesting story. And knowing that your mom was a janitor, that my mom was one too, and your dad a farm worker. How did the son of a janitor and a farm worker end up going to Harvard and Stanford, the one of the two most revered universities in the United States? What was it like for you as a kid growing up in that environment?
You know, people ask me that all the time. I think the thing that the thing that propelled me was, I got my first job when I was 12 years old working in a restaurant. And I knew then I never wanted to work in a restaurant again. The food service industry was just not for me. So then thereafter, my older sister was the one who said in the summers, because she was a year and a half older than me, she is a year and a half older than I am, that she wanted to go work in the fields. So around Lubbock, where we grew up, there's a lot of cotton and cornfields and other things. And so in the summers, a lot of Mexican American children, when I was growing up, would go work in the fields like our parents had as migrant farm workers. So when my sister announced to my parents that she wanted to go do that work, my father said, okay, but if you're going, Ray has to go because he's a boy. And so all of a sudden, my future was decided because my sister. So I think we probably spent the next 4 or 5 summers working in the fields, much like our parents had done, although we weren't migrating, but we were going out and we were working the same kind of long days that you talked about when you arrived in the United States. I remember we'd get up at 5 or so in the morning. We'd be on the road to the fields by about 6 or so. And then we'd be chopping weeds around the cotton or picking the corn or doing whatever the field work was. And that pretty much taught me that I did not want to do that for the rest of my life. So those summer jobs were very motivational, that no matter what, I knew I was good in school. I had been getting straight A's. And if there was a way to go to college, I was going to do it. So I just kind of knew that. And I took all the bad jobs, which is kind of interesting, because I have an 18-year-old now. And sometimes when he's getting a part-time job he doesn't like, he will complain. And I'm like, look, all of us have to do those crappy jobs unless you're born to wealth or privilege. And I said, you're not born to wealth or privilege, so you're going to do some jobs you may not like. But at any rate, so when I got to high school and kept doing well and competing, I just kind of reached out to the counselors and the guidance counselors. And one of my counselors was particularly helpful. And so I just knew to follow her advice. So what she told me was that because I wasn't born to wealth or privilege, I should go to one of the U.S. military academies. And so, that I started looking at, West Point, and I thought, well, I don't want to be in the Army. Those guys go in first. And then the Naval Academy, I didn't think that sounded great, but the Air Force Academy sounded really interesting. So I actually started out at the Air Force Academy. She helped me get a congressional nomination, which is what you need. And nobody else told me about financial aid or anything. So I went off to the Air Force Academy and I did basic training there. And I was on a perfect glide path to success in the Air Force, right? Because if you go to one of the academies, you get 4 years of education for free, and then you're set. I was 18 and I was looking at 4 years of college at the academy, plus another year of flight training because I had 20/20 vision, and then another year of payback for that year of training. And so when you added it all together, I was going to be 30 when I got out of the Air Force. And I just remember at 18 thinking, I don't have a background in the military, and I don't come from the colonels and the generals like many of the kids that were at the academy with me. They all had backgrounds from their family. So I decided to leave, and I went. I ended basic training and went back to Lubbock, which was not planned. My family had not planned on my coming back, and I go over to Texas Tech, and which is in Lubbock, a few blocks from my parents' house, and I started at Tech, with some handouts and some money. And then I looked at what's the number one program in psychology, because at that time I thought I was going to be a psychologist, and it was Stanford. Okay, there we go. We have more in common. Stanford had the number one psychology program, so all I did was spend a year at Tech and think about how do I transfer to Stanford? Because by that point, I knew that there was financial aid and that you could go to these big universities even if you hadn't had that kind of a background or didn't have the money. So I applied, and Stanford had the number one program in psychology, so I thought, off I go. And I got transferred into Stanford. And then Stanford had a program where you could get your bachelor's degree and your master's degree together in 5 years. And that would save you a year because generally, a bachelor's degree takes 4 and a master's degree takes another 2. So getting them in 5 would save you a year. Well, having spent time at the Air Force Academy, I was not, looking to delay anything. So I completed that program in 4 years, and I got my bachelor's and my master's from Stanford with honors in 4 years. And then when I applied to Harvard, it was pretty easy because I had gotten both degrees in 4 years from Stanford. And so I got into that. And, I'm sure you're going to get into this later, but I went to college and law school with a very civil rights minded background, and thinking and commitment that I wanted to help the kinds of people that I came from and the communities that I came from and do good by my community. And so that's kind of why I decided, whatever can help me do that. And I knew getting degrees from major national and international schools would help that. And so as doors opened, I stepped in every time.
Yeah. And when you went to Harvard and Stanford, I can only guess you're probably not going to have other students that look like you. There isn't going to be a lot of them. What was it like for you being a minority, a Mexican American, in a sea of people from the dominant culture?
Yeah, it was it was good because California is still more diverse than many other areas. And so, although there weren't a lot of us, there was a good core amount of us, I will say, because, the greater Southwest does have a pretty strong Mexican American community. Stanford had these theme houses that were and continue to be pretty controversial, but they were an African American theme house, Chicano theme house or Latino theme house, an Asian American theme house. And the idea behind those is that at least half of the population of residents in that dorm, that theme house dorm, has to be African American or has to be Latino or Chicano or has to be Asian. And in those theme houses, there was a lot of celebration of culture. So the Mexican American theme house was called Zapata, Casa Zapata. And that's where I was placed. And that's where I asked to be placed in my first year. And that was the biggest help in terms of adjusting to Stanford, because, again, it was a Mexican American theme house. One half were not Mexican American, but half were. And so we would talk amongst each others, and virtually all of us were first generation, in college, if not first generation high school. So I was in the first cohort of high school graduates, like I said, but my sister, who's a year and a half earlier, actually graduated before I did. But me and my cousins that are our age were the first Mexican Americans in our family to graduate high school consistently. So when I got to Stanford, that was really the first time since high school, and well, not since high school, that was really the first time in my life that I was with a bunch of other Mexican Americans that were equally driven and that had equally persevered and that had similar backgrounds, because we were all the sons and daughters largely of migrant farm workers or mechanics or construction workers, the trades jobs and those kinds of things. There were a few who were second generation or third generation college, but most of us were not. And so we were all figuring it out together, right? How to get the financial aid that we needed, how to plan, how to support ourselves. So I spent my first year in that Casa Zapata. And for me, it was wonderful. I made strong connections, including my best friend. And then after that, I lived in other places, in other dorms throughout the university. And by my final year, I was a resident assistant. So I was in charge of the dorm, and that gave me free housing. So for me, going into Stanford, even though it was, one of these bastions of white supremacy in many ways, you found your community. And for me, that was the Latino community that helped. And then after spending that incubator, time in Casa Zapata, I could go anywhere on campus, and I knew where my roots were and my campus friends were, and that helped a lot. At Harvard, it was all sort of another start. Harvard's classes in those days were about 550 entering students. My class at Harvard in 1987 was the largest class of Latinos Harvard had ever accepted, and it was only 40. So of the 540 in the entering class, only 40 of us were Hispanic or Latino in some way. So the second and third year students that were above of us were even less diverse, And by the time I got to Harvard, it was not the case that all those Latinos were predominantly Mexican American. They were of all stripes, right? They were Guatemalan, they were Peruvian, they were Cuban, Puerto Rican. It was a very diverse diaspora, even within the Latino community at Harvard. But again, for me, that was my community, and those are still my best friends to this day. And so, you found out how to navigate the system. For me, it was particularly enriching at Harvard because when I became dean and I got appointed dean here at Capitol, my friends from that community found out about it, and they decided to have it was in the midst of the pandemic, a celebration on Zoom to celebrate my being appointed. And so the scheduled celebration was for an hour, I think maybe an hour and a half. We ended up staying on the Zoom call for 3 hours because we really hadn't come together in our now, at that time, I guess I had graduated 30 years ago. Now I've graduated 32 years ago. But when I got appointed, it was 30 years. And we really hadn't gotten together as a cohort since our graduation. So it really is interesting that for 30 years, I was in touch with some of them, but not all of us together. And yet 30 years later, we picked up where we left off and we were all in community again. So there were some challenging times, and financial aid and figuring out how to pay your American Express with your MasterCard with your Visa with your whatever. I always tell students, I know some of them are living on, some of our students today are living on tuna fish and chips and crackers or whatever. And I'm like, we all do what we have to do to get by. But at the end of the day, getting a law degree is an excellent investment, and it'll pay off. And it did for me.
Yeah, when you wanted to go to law school, you had the intention of practicing civil rights, especially defending the rights of Mexican Americans. But your first job out of law school was at a big law firm where you handled corporate bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. What changed?
So it's interesting because the way that I got into teaching was in my second year in law school, I had a professor who handled, her name was Susan Estridge, and she was the first woman president of the Harvard Law Review when she was a student herself at Harvard. And she was, if not the first woman tenured, one of the first women tenured at Harvard Law School. And she was extraordinarily accomplished in so many ways. But what she did in my second year in law school, she was the campaign manager for Michael Dukakis, who ran for president. And so when that did not pan out, she came back to Harvard to teach. And so she was teaching a course called election law in the spring semester after the fall campaign had not worked out. And I'll never forget, she started the first day of class. So me and my friend Rudy were in that class. And he's another Mexican-American from Texas. And so Professor Esther started out the course and she said, why don't we go around the room and tell a little bit about ourselves and why we're here. And she said, my name is Susan Estrich and I'm here because we lost. Because the campaign, Michael Dukakis' campaign had lost. And so I just thought that was hilarious. And what she wanted us to do for that course, it was election law, and she wanted us to write a paper. So my friend Rudy and I, coming both from Texas, both Mexican Americans, we're going to write on Mexican Americans and elections in Texas. And this is in 1988, I guess. So we didn't have, the bells and whistles that we have today in terms of PowerPoint and all that. But I've always been very meticulous. And so she let us sign up for the order in which we wanted to present. And I decided I wanted to present first because I didn't want to be there waiting on week 2 and week 3 and week 4 and week 5 and just anxious. So I put together a bunch of flow charts and transparencies. We had transparencies in those days to kind of illustrate all the points I wanted to make in my research and the paper I wanted to write. And after I was done, Professor Estrich pulled me aside and she said, that was really good. You need to teach. You need to think about law school teaching. I thought, oh my God, no. So then what happened was Harvard had a winter semester in between the fall and the summer. In between the fall and the spring, it's a 1-month winter term. And so I had been following the Hispanic school board member in Lubbock, Texas, as she was suing the Lubbock Independent School District. And so I found out that we could do something called field work, independent field work. And you could, leave Harvard for that 1 semester if you wanted to and go work in a real case. And so I contacted her, and her name is Linda De Leon. And I said, Ms. De Leon, my name is Ray Valencia. I'm originally from Lubbock, Texas. I'm a second-year law student. I'd like to help you on your case. I see you're suing the Lubbock Independent School District. I don't know what it's about. And she said, who are you? And I always tell students the story and say, you have to be persistent. So I repeated it again. I said, my name is Ray Valencia. I'm from Lubbock originally. I see you're suing the Lubbock Independent School District. I have, a winter term. I could come help you. And she said, oh, that sounds fantastic. I said, well, great. Tell me who your lawyer is so I can contact that person to see if they would be willing to supervise me, because I already have a supervisor at my home school. Excuse me. And so she said, well, I actually have 4 lawyers. And one of them turned out to be a law professor at Texas Tech University. So he seemed logical to contact him. So I contacted him and I said, Professor Benson was his name. I said, Professor Benson, my name is Ray Valencia. I'm a second-year law student. I've been following the case with Linda De Leon. I spoke with her. I'd like to come help you on it for free. And I could do this independent field work. And if we put together the 2 weeks of Christmas vacation with the 4 weeks of January, I can give you 6 weeks of free labor. And he said, who are you? And so I had to repeat it all again. And ultimately, he agreed to supervise me. And I traveled to Lubbock in the spring semester or January of my second year. And I worked on the case. The case had to do with the Lubbock Independent School District had been sued to desegregate under Brown versus Board, which was a 1954 case. Excuse me. Lubbock got sued to desegregate in 1970. And it turned out the lawsuit to desegregate the Lubbock Independent School District was filed the month and the year I entered the Lubbock Independent School District as a kindergartner. So all these years later, when I'm a second-year law student, that lawsuit is still going on. And what we were fighting over was Ms. De Leon was now elected to the school board. She had been a very active community member and activist in the Latino community in Lubbock. And then when Lubbock went from at-large voting to single-member district voting, she got elected from the predominantly Latino area of town, and she was now on the school board. So they were withholding information from her, and there was a suit, and she basically settled it on the condition that Lubbock provide equal opportunities for all students, and that the high school and junior highs and elementary schools be maintained equally. That was number one. And number two, that they build a junior high school in the area of town which had no junior high school, which was predominantly Hispanic. Those were the sole two issues. So I traveled to Lubbock and I wrote a brief that got us back into federal court to show that Lubbock was not compliant with that agreement with Ms. De Leon. And I finished it after 6 weeks, and I turned it into the lawyers, and I went to my mom's house, and I was scheduled to fly back to law school the next morning, which I'll never forget. It was Friday, and I was going to go back to law school like on Saturday morning. And we're having dinner, and the phone rings, and this is the days when the phones were still on the wall and stuff. And my mom picked it up, and she said, "It's for you." And I said, "Okay." And I said, "Hello." And it was the lawyers. And so it was Professor Benson. And he said, "Ray, we're sitting here with all the lawyers, and we just read your brief." And I thought, oh my God. And I held my breath, and he said, "And it is outstanding. It is wonderful. You knocked it out of the ballpark. We're going to submit it to federal court just as you wrote it. Of course, because you're a lawyer, you can't, because you're a law student and not yet a lawyer, you can't sign it." So he says, "And you need to think about coming to teach at Texas Tech." And I was like, oh my God, no. I spent all my life trying to get out of Lubbock, Texas. And again, teaching was something so far removed from whatever I had always thought about, because I wanted to go work in civil rights and all that. So kind of put that away. But that was the second time. The third time that something happened was the same thing. In third year, I'm now in a class during that winter term. It was gender discrimination, and it met for a month. And I am in a gender discrimination class with about probably 70 people, and there were 7 men, and all the rest were women. But I kept putting my hand up and giving my views and everything. There was a Harvard College professor named Lenore Weitzman, who had a very famous research on women and divorce and what happens to women after divorce, how they fall into poverty, and men generally increase in terms of their wealth. And I knew about her because I had studied sociology and those kinds of things at Stanford in my undergraduate. So she was sitting in on that class at the law school to see how gender discrimination was taught from the law school perspective. And so what I did was basically, I knew she was there, but I wasn't really talking to her or anything. And when the class ended for the semester, she called me over and she said, "I've been listening to you, and you're very brave, one of the few men, and that didn't deter you." She said, "I'm teaching gender discrimination at Harvard College this spring," which was going to start like in a week. "And I'd like you to be one of the teaching assistants. And would you do that?" That was the third time somebody told me I should teach. So I agreed to do that. And then I loved it, right? I had the class was like 250 people. And each of the teaching assistants, we had our own group of 20 that we worked with. And I figured I loved it. So I called Dan Benson up, and I said, "Professor Benson, you invited me to think about teaching at Tech, and I didn't really think about that last year. As it turns out, I'm now a third year, and I figured out that civil rights work is great and wonderful, but it doesn't pay. So I've taken a job with a large law firm, and my idea is I'm going to work with a large law firm in Dallas right out of law school for a couple of years, pay off some debt, and then go into civil rights. But this teaching thing has come up, and it's really interesting. So I wanted to see if there was any more discussions we might have about what we could do." So he was the first one who ever said to me, what he said was, "Are you going to be in Lubbock anytime soon?" And I said, I hadn't thought about it. He said, "Well, why don't you come home for spring break, and I'll set up a meeting with the dean for you." And I said, okay. So I traveled to Lubbock, Texas as a third-year law student. I was 25, I think. And I had a letter of recommendation from 2 professors, one of them being Susan Estrich, saying that I could teach. And the dean of the law school took me out to lunch, and he said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, this is 1990. And I said, I think your law school needs a course on race and racism, and a course on gender discrimination, because issues of race and issues of gender involve the law, impact the law, and the law impacts issues of gender and race in turn. And I've got my bachelor's degree in psychology, my master's degrees in sociology. I have this social science background, and I'm now going to be a lawyer. And I think your school would benefit from having somebody teaching about these important areas." And the dean was fantastic. He said, "Okay, you're hired." So at 25, I went back to Harvard. This is again before cell phones and emails and all that. And my friends, a few of them knew what was going on, and they said, "What happened?" And I said, "I'm a professor." So I became an adjunct professor of law when I was in my third year in law school during spring break. I had not graduated law school. I had not sat for the bar, studied for the bar, taken the bar, or passed the bar. But my goal was to go to a big firm for a couple of years, do that, and then go into civil rights. The entire time I was at that large law firm, and that large law firm at that time was the second largest law firm in the world. It was a firm by the name of Jones Day. So I ended up doing corporate bankruptcy, corporate restructuring, a lot of corporate complex litigation, things like that. I ended up staying at that firm for 5 years because the money was good and the work was very challenging and interesting. I liked it more than I originally thought. But I never meant to stay at a big firm for a long time. I didn't want to make partner, as they say. I just wanted to kind of get as much experience as I could and do all that. The entire time I worked in Dallas, however, I would fly to Lubbock once a week, and I would teach. One semester I teach gender discrimination, and one semester I teach race and racism. So I did that for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, I thought, I don't think I want to go into civil rights work. I really like this teaching. And so I pivoted and I applied for teaching positions in Texas. And I wound up at a school much like Capital Law School. St. Mary's University is a Catholic Marianist school in San Antonio whose mission and its founding is rooted in access and opportunity and making lawyers or helping to make lawyers from underrepresented communities. And that was a mission that just sounded fantastic. So I ended up leaving the big firm and going into full-time teaching in 1995. And that's how I ended up not going into civil rights, but instead going to full-time teaching.
Wow. And when you started teaching, you were 25. You were the youngest professor they will ever hire at that university. How did you handle the pressure?
Well, it's funny because I guess the reason that I got the job, I guess, is in part because I had nothing to lose, right? I had my big firm job when I got set up to meet with the dean of Texas Tech. So it wasn't like if I didn't do well in the classroom, not that, I mean, I'm a type A, so I want to do well in whatever I do. But there was no sense that, oh my gosh, if I screw this up, I'm going to get fired and then I won't have, money to pay back my loans and money to pay my house or my rent, my apartment or all the other needs that I have. So there was some freedom in that. And so I figured when I went for the interview, if he said, no, you're only 25 and what the heck do you have to offer? It was going to be no great loss because I had my big firm job that the whole purpose was to, pay down some debt and make a lot of money. So I didn't have a whole lot of pressure going in. And once he said that I could do it, it was kind of like a shot of confidence. I thought, well, he's the dean of a law school. If he thinks I can do it, who am I to contradict him? And then I just started teaching and I always received very strong student evaluations. And, I've been doing this now. I'm going to go into my 32nd year of doing this. But I always tell people I started so young. So I was like the age of the law students. Then I became older. So I became like their older brother. Then I became older and I became like their uncle. And now I'm like their father. And soon to be grandfather, I think. But yeah, the pressure for teaching was never there. I think I connected very well with the students. I knew exactly, especially the students of color at Texas Tech. There were so few of them in those days. And I was one of the few professors of color that they had. So they were all extraordinarily supportive. I got strong teaching evaluations and I loved it. What I would do, just to kind of give you an idea, is this is before the 9/11, right? So I would go to the office and I would work till about 12 or 1, say on a Monday. My classes were always on a Monday or a Friday. And then I would leave downtown Dallas, the big high rise that I worked in, and I could be at Love Field within 30 minutes. And then I would just walk through security and I would get on the plane. I'd be in Lubbock in an hour and my mom or sister or somebody would pick me up and I'd teach from say 2:30 to 4:30. And then I'd go to my parents' house and my sisters, my aunts and uncles or whoever would come over for dinner. We'd have good Mexican food. And then I'd be back in Dallas by 8 o'clock. So it was a great opportunity for me too, to keep up with my family. And so I did that from Dallas 5 years. And then when I took the job in San Antonio, I still did an adjunct teaching for 7 more years. So I was an adjunct flying in once a week at Texas Tech for 12 years teaching these courses. And then I've always taught the race course and the gender course as well at all the institutions I've taught it. I have yet to teach it at Capital, but I'm looking forward to one day.
Thank you. And you've written a lot of articles, a lot of books, and a lot of journals over the years. But then you wrote this book with other people. It's called Mexican Americans and the Law.
Yes.
What inspired you to write this particular book?
Well, it's again, it's like my life has been full of stories. But again, I guess what I would say to anybody listening and what I tell my students is when opportunity knocks and somebody's trying to give you an opportunity, step into the space. Even if you haven't done it, you'll figure it out. Have confidence in yourself. So in 1999, no, I'm sorry. Yes, in 1999, I applied for the White House Fellowship. And the White House Fellowship is a program that was started under the Johnson administration. And the idea is to bring young professionals from all over the country. You don't have to have a particular background or degree or discipline or anything. The idea is just that you should have been excellent. And the median age of a White House Fellow when I applied was about 34. And I was right at that time. And it's a nonpartisan program that, irrespective of whether you're Republican or Democrat, there's a commission that selects White House Fellows. By law, they have to accept 16, no more than 19. And in any given year, they'll have 1,000 applications, and then they winnow it down. And so I had heard that Colin Powell was a White House Fellow, Doris Corns Goodwin was a White House Fellow, Henry Cisneros, the former mayor of San Antonio, was a White House Fellow, and other notable people that I admired. So I thought that would be a very nice thing to do. So the year that I went up for tenure at St. Mary's, I also decided to apply for the White House Fellowship because it was going to be the last year of the Clinton administration. And I figured I might have more luck with the Democratic administration than I would with the Republican administration because I'm a Democrat. And so I applied. And so I was selected, and I spent a year working in the Clinton administration and the White House Office of the Chief of Staff. The commissioners that decide who gets selected, the 16 to 19 that get selected, that commission is appointed by the president, and it's about 33 people or so. One of the women on the commission was a woman named Adela de la Torre, and she was the chair of the Mexican American Center at the University of Arizona. And so when I was in the middle of my White House Fellowship, Adela reached out to me and she said, I'm doing this series on Mexican Americans and Mexican Americans in health, Mexican Americans in poverty, Mexican Americans and legislation, or Mexican Americans and business. And she said, you're a lawyer. I need you to write me the Mexican Americans in the law book. And I said, I'm a little busy serving the president right now. So can we talk about this after my fellowship year? And she said, oh, sure, of course. And so once I left the fellowship, I reached out to her and I said, do you still need that book? And she said, yes. And I said, well, I have some wonderful colleagues here at St. Mary's. We can split the chapters. We all have expertise in different areas of Mexican Americans. And we would love to write it for you. And so that's how the book came about, because Adela asked me to do it.
Oh, thank you. And it's a well-written book. It's very educative and informative. Reading the book, I learned a lot of some of the things that I have been, I was ignorant of, and which also most Americans are ignorant of those facts. For instance, when it comes to issue of jumping the border in places like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and talking about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Like I said, I'm sort of third generation Mexican American. The Southwest was Mexico at one point, and many people forget that. So I think when a lot of people think about the United States, they think about, the Statue of Liberty and New York Harbor and immigrants coming in through the East Coast. And that is certainly one migrant experience. But the Mexican American experience is totally different, because this was a southern United States area that was Mexico at some point. And then all of a sudden, In 1848, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States gains all the greater Southwest area. And all of a sudden, people that had been living there were now pronounced to be foreigners. So many Mexican Americans in the Southwest say, we did not come to the United States. The United States came to us. And that is true for many generations, particularly in New Mexico. So we start as a Mexican American community from a very different starting point in terms of the way we view immigration. And when many people say, well, go back to your country, it's like, well, I'm third generation American. Exactly where am I supposed to go? And for people who have been here longer than that, where are they supposed to go? So, the United States history of conquest is not without incident. And that greater Southwest story is a very different story and a very different experience than, say, the Cuban population, who, because they were coming from primarily a communist regime, the United States stood in the shores of Miami and said, come to me, my people, you know the evils of communism. When you are receiving a group with open hands like that, it's very different than the experience of Mexican Americans who were being, pushed back and kicked back and had many of the same kinds of discriminatory tactics used against them that African Americans in the South suffered under Jim Crow. There was not a whole bunch of difference. There were signs that would say, no dogs or Mexican Americans allowed in restaurants in those days. My parents grew up in that kind of environment and had those kinds of experiences. There were schools in the Southwest that were prohibited from letting students speak Spanish. There were places that, much like today, Mexican Americans were disenfranchised in terms of not being able to vote unless they paid a poll tax and things like that. So many of the same things that happened in Jim Crow Southern United States to African Americans were happening to Mexican Americans at the same time.
And then there was the controversy, the issue of languages about Mexicans speaking Spanish or receiving instructions in Spanish in school. How is that related to civil rights?
It's interesting because the issue of language is something that it is a language minority issue that is not generally one for African Americans in the country, right? Who for the most part, grew up speaking English. And so this is where Asians and Latinos have a slightly different experience. So there were certainly communities that were prohibited from speaking Spanish or told not to speak Spanish or not encouraged to speak Spanish, not allowed to speak Spanish in the schools. And the idea was that was inhibiting students from acclimating and becoming true citizens. Never mind that these children were born in the US, like I was born in the US, speaking primarily Spanish at the beginning. But there was this notion that they needed to be inculcated with American values. And the first of those values, if not one of the first of those values, was to learn and be an English speaker. What happened in turn, in addition to the schools doing that, was that many parents of people my age or older, they decided they were not going to speak Spanish to their children, such as not to inhibit them. And so the notion was, well, if I want my child to succeed in the United States, the Spanish language was a hindrance to me when I was in school. And so I don't want my kid to face the same kind of discrimination. And so they didn't pass the language along and they didn't pass it on. And so there's a lot of people who are of Latino origin, Latinx origin today, who don't speak Spanish, not because the system didn't allow them to, but because the system in prior days hadn't allowed their parents, and their parents in turn tried to protect the kids from not having that same experience. And so the language did not continue in the same way. But the issue of language is one that comes up in terms of Title VII, discrimination on the basis of race, ancestry, and the like. And there's been some debates about whether language is one of those protected categories, given that it's not race specific, because anybody can speak Spanish. And so depending on the different kinds of courts that have come down and the systems that have come down, protection of the Spanish language has been something Mexican Americans have won rights in.
Thank you. And even looking at it through the lens of the law, when the treaty was signed in 1848, it was to respect whatever culture and language that the people in those territories had, which would be Spanish or whatever native languages that they had at the time. So prohibiting them from receiving instructions in school or speaking the language itself, isn't that a violation of that treaty?
Yeah, there were the United States treatment of Native Americans vis-a-vis treaties that they entered with Native Americans is similar to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the various promises contained in the treaty when the U.S. was acquired, or when the southwestern U.S. was acquired by the United States. And the promises that were made in terms of protection of culture and language and all those things were, as with many Native American communities, things that were promptly ignored by the United States in terms of its obligations. So there's still some suits today from families that own large tracts of land, on the borderland, still under the treaty. People still fighting for treaty rights generations later.
Yeah, it's understandable. And looking at it from the Mexican American point of view, it seems like it's more like a double whammy. Because if you look at the history of Mexico itself, even Spanish itself is not the native language of the people of Mexico, because that itself is a language of the colonizer. And
Yes.
now you take away the natural language, you're also trying to take away even the other language they're being indoctrinated with, compared to places like Louisiana, where was a former French colony, and
Right.
they still maintain some of the French culture and language.
Yes. Yes. And the federal law does protect under the Voting Rights Act, ballots being published in various languages that are responsive to the local community. And so there are some laws that have helped on some fronts. But that is definitely, there's always a US English only initiative in a legislature or the US Congress being introduced to make English the official language of the United States. It is the unofficial, undoubtedly unofficial language of the United States. But that for some people, many people, it's still not enough. They want it declared to be officially the only language so that you don't do anything and don't transact any business except in English. Um, that's already true primarily. If you go into the courtrooms, and I have been in some cases in deep South Texas, in Harlingen, Texas, or those kinds of areas, Uvalde, where the unfortunate mass shooting happened. There are some communities in which the language can be conducted in Spanish, but it's not that it's not conducted in English. It's just that the community speaks Spanish. And so, the court clerk or the judge or somebody might have a great deal of facility with Spanish and just try to help the 90-year-old person in front of them by speaking Spanish. But that's not to say that they can't do it in English. It's just, it's a thing to help the local community. So, but some people view that as very anti-American.
You wrote in the book, and I'm quoting, as long as Mexican American identity was defined and shaped by others, Mexican Americans had little control over the status within the legal system. Can you shed more light on this statement?
Yeah, there was a very famous case that came up 2 weeks before Brown versus Board. It was Hernandez versus Texas, and this case had to do with juries. And in the Hernandez case, there was a county in Texas that for years, despite the fact that there was a very robust population of Mexican Americans in that county, had not had a Mexican American serve on a jury. And so Pete Hernandez was arrested for murder, and he was charged with murder. And this is the Hernandez case. He was convicted by an all-white jury, much like many African Americans in the Southwest were convicted by all-white juries. And when he raised the issue that the jury did not contain a jury of his peers, the state of Texas appealed. And Gus Garcia and another lawyer, Gus Garcia ultimately became a judge. Well, he became the first Mexican American law professor in the country at St. Mary's Law School, and later became an appellate judge in the Fourth Court of Appeals of Texas in San Antonio. But as a young lawyer or younger lawyer, he and his fellow lawyer took the case up to the Supreme Court. The way that the state of Texas argued the case was to say, well, Mexican Americans aren't a different race, they're white. And so, because they're white, we can't be discriminating against the white race by doing things like excluding Mexican Americans from the jury. And this was laughable to anybody in the 40s and the 50s and the 30s and the 60s who lived in Texas or the greater Southwest, because it was very clear that the state of Texas was engaging in severe forms of discrimination against Mexican Americans in the voting booths, in schools, in other areas. But yet, when it came to the Supreme Court, the state of Texas had the audacity to say that Mexican Americans were white. And so by trying to do that, and there's one of my law school colleagues is a professor at Berkeley Law School. He's written an entire book about Mexican Americans and white identity. The state of Texas tried to say we did nothing wrong. The Supreme Court, using examples of these kinds of forms of discrimination in the Hernandez versus Texas case, said, no, you can't do that, Texas. It is very clear that Mexican Americans, although as a racial group might correctly be identified as white, you are not treating them as white. You are discriminating on these various grounds. And so that identity, you don't get to define. And what we were writing in the book is about issues of that sort, that while others were trying to say Mexican Americans can't do this, can't do that, can't do that, they're white and trying to do all these things until Gus Garcia and fellow lawyers in the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, which is the equivalent of the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund, started bringing these lawsuits and identifying and creating a Mexican American identity that was identifiable in the law and protected by law and achieving protections for Mexican Americans in the law. Until that happened, we were not in charge of our own destiny.
So the identity of Mexican Americans was being defined according to white population or white law or white rule of law.
Exactly.
Yes. Then in 1954, you talked about Brown versus Board of Education. Even though the Supreme Court at that time outlawed segregation in school, it was very difficult for Mexican Americans to be integrated into the school system. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that was challenged in court?
Sure. In general or in a particular case?
You can list a particular case, because there are cases about funding, there are cases about language, there are cases where they have, even in places where they have Mexican Americans there, they keep them apart with African Americans, and they're receiving different instructions, disparate funding and disparate in instructions.
Sure. And this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier in my own case in Lubbock and the desegregation case. So Brown versus Board comes down in 1954, and it basically says discrimination in schools is illegal, and you can't engage in discrimination against. You can't have separate white schools and black schools and Hispanic schools and Asian schools, et cetera, et cetera. The case that I was talking about earlier, Hernandez versus Texas, that case came down 2 weeks before Brown versus Board, but that case is not as known as Brown versus Board. And so that's another kind of thing that we try to highlight in the book, that Mexican Americans have been active in civil rights and have had major cases and major wins, particularly in the discrimination area. So when Brown versus Board came down, it didn't necessarily have a reception where all the school districts around the country said, oh, okay, well, the Supreme Court has said we have to desegregate and we can't segregate anymore, and we have to provide equal opportunity. Rather, these fights went on for a very long time. There were many schools in the South that just said, well, that doesn't apply to us. The United States Supreme Court doesn't have any merit in, say, Arkansas or Georgia or Alabama or something, right? So it was fought. And as I indicated earlier, in Texas, the lawsuit to desegregate the Lubbock Independent School District, which is where I was filed in 1970. And that was the month and the year that I entered the Lubbock Independent School District as a kindergartner. Of course, I had no idea about that, but that was a case based on Brown versus Board in 1954. 16 years later, LISD still hadn't done what it needed to do, and it finally got sued, right? So this is how long and how hard it was to take Brown as a case and a pronouncement and actually actualize it in individual cases. So that's just kind of a quick background. But before Brown versus Board, of course, we often hear about the desegregation and the things that led to Brown versus Board. But there were similar cases that were being litigated by Mexican Americans in the Southwest, in California, in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, on the same basis that Mexican Americans were being given separate schools under the separate but equal doctrine that preceded Brown versus Board. So in 1898, Plessy versus Ferguson was a case in which there was an African American in a train, and he was relegated to the back of the train with African Americans, and he sued. And the United States, instead of saying you can't do that, said, okay, if you're going to segregate blacks and whites, you have to provide separate but equal kinds of facilities in housing, in education, in transportation, and in all these areas. So that's what led to, in the educational context, many schools in the South and many schools in the Southwest segregating African Americans and providing separate schools, or Latinos and African Americans and providing separate schools for them. The problem was that separate in theory was never equal in fact, as is often quoted, right? The Black schools and the Latino schools often turned out to have worse books, underpaid teachers, much worse facilities, and a whole host of other problems. And so, as is true with most litigation that winds up in something like a Brown versus Board, there were cases that came out of California. There was a significant case that came out of California that preceded Brown versus Board, that had it not been settled, it would have come to the Supreme Court and maybe have been the Brown versus Board, but with Latino plaintiffs. So in that case, what happened was there were actually, it was even sadder than we think about. There were an Asian couple that, because of the internment of Japanese in California, were removed from their farm, and in came a Mexican American and her husband, who was, I believe, Puerto Rican, and they moved into this home of the Asian couple that was interned. And they tried to register their kids to go to school. And the school said, well, no, you're Mexican American. You can't go to this school, which is the better school, the white school that has the good teachers that have higher pay, better books, better facilities. You've got to go to the Mexican school. So this couple challenged that, and they then won in California, and they won on appeal. And so that couple was fighting the same fight that African Americans were fighting in the greater Southwest, and they were winning. The issue, though, was when they won on appeal, the state of California decided not to challenge it to the Supreme Court. So they won on appeal, and that stayed the law for California. But because California didn't appeal, it didn't go up to the Supreme Court. Brown versus Board, however, was appealed from Kansas and the other states that are in that case. And that's why we got the pronouncement that you cannot segregate in Brown versus Board out of that case, rather than the other case out of California involving Mexican Americans. But Mexican Americans were in their own fights, fighting the same issues and having the same civil rights wins and many losses, right alongside our African American brothers and sisters and Asian brothers and sisters.
Thank you. Then we have the recent mass shooting in Uvalde and the police response to that shooting. Is there, knowing the history of Mexican Americans and the legal system, is there a nexus between that historical disparity and the way the police handled that incident?
This one is a tough one, because when you get to the areas of South Texas, like Uvalde, which is only a few miles from San Antonio, where I did live and work for 21 years, it is predominantly it is predominantly Mexican American, right? The city council is predominantly Mexican American. The chief of police, the district attorney, all of those players in all of those roles are predominantly Mexican American. In the case of the Uvalde shootings, it turns out that the chief of police of the school was the individual who apparently made the call to not go in and rescue the children right away. And that's the thing that is leading most people, or that is giving most people the frustration of trying to understand what in the heck happened. That individual, I don't know that he's Mexican American, but he has a Spanish surname. His name is Arredondo, I believe. And, he hasn't said a lot. But what's been interesting to me is that even though that community is predominantly Mexican American, and he, the chief of police of the school system, was the one that made the call, when the state of Texas comes in and tries to take over at the Department of Public Safety level, the governor and all that, those players are all virtually all white, right? And they're trying to take over for this Mexican American community. And obviously their story has not been consistent, and now it's falling apart, and there's a whole bunch of holes. So there's a whole bunch of questions that are still remaining about it. It does appear that the community is outraged, as is the United States, as to why you would wait so long. And I have to say, I do have a great deal of sympathy for the police, who are trying to do their best under extreme circumstances, not knowing where the shooter's going to be, who the shooter is, what the shooter has, and all of that. But I do think there's a lot of people, including myself, wondering, does that mean that you wait an hour or more? I'm not there. I didn't make the call. We still haven't heard from that chief of police, who appears to be of Latino descent. But it does seem to me that an hour is a very long time. And if I were a parent of that child, I would want a lot of answers. And the fact that Texas hasn't been able to produce those answers to date in a consistent and coherent manner that makes sense, that could be understood, and that could give relief to the families of those children is not a good result.
It's very sad. And you moved to Ohio in the middle of the pandemic.
Yes.
What was that transition like for you and your three sons?
That was very hard, I will say. So I have an 18, 17, and 13-year-old. And when we moved, they were 2 years younger. So I guess they were 15, 14, and 11. So we come to Ohio, a state in which we do not have any families or strong bonds. Now I've been at work 2 years, and I have a lot of very good friends and strong bonds. But in those days, it was very hard. We came by ourselves, and the kids were not able to go to school because it was the pandemic. So they were engaging in online learning, and then things transitioned to where they could begin to go to school 2 days a week or 3 days a week. I myself got to this beautiful building that we have for the law school and to the office that I sit in. And on my first day at work in August of 2020, I had my assistant sitting outside and our fundraiser person who helps me with fundraising and maybe 2 security guards. And this is a school with 500 plus students, and nobody was in the building. And I remember sitting down at this chair in this office with this background that you see and thinking, I'm in charge of nothing and no one. So my first year on the job, it was a bunch of Zoom meetings. And I did meet a lot of the students via Zoom and a lot of the faculty. But at the end of my first year as dean, just to give you an example of how different it was, I probably met no more than 20 students in person. And I probably did not meet about a third of the faculty in person. Now, I had Zooms with all the faculty and faculty meetings and all that, but there were a good number of my faculty colleagues even that I hadn't met because they just were not coming in given the circumstances and the danger. We still didn't have a vaccine at that point. So people were asking us, well, how do you like Ohio and what are your favorite places to eat and things like that? And I would just laugh because I'm like, this is not emblematic of what it usually is for when somebody moves into this wonderful city where they can go to restaurants and hang out and do the schools and see what they think about the schools. We just didn't have that experience. But after that first year, things have changed. My sons love their schools. I obviously love my job. It's challenging, but it's a lot of fun getting to know the school. And again, this school is so much like the schools that I had worked at in Texas in terms of being a school of access and opportunity with a mission of providing for the community, being invested in the community, supporting the community, that for me, that kind of a transition was easy. So I love the work. I love the people. That first year was very different.
Thank you. And for the past hour, you've been educating us about Mexican Americans and the law and telling us your wonderful story. What does it mean for you to come on this show, Legal Angle?
You know, I have had so many wonderful experiences in my life. I've been so lucky. I went, as you indicated, to some of the top institutions in the country, of the world. I was able to work at the White House. I was able to be a professor, and now, after that, I was associate dean, and now I'm dean. And the things I get to do now as dean, in terms of meeting with people like yourself. I'm coming from Denver, where I met one of our other wonderful alums. And to get to meet alumni who went to this institution, and knowing that this institution provided you the opportunity to do the wonderful things that you are doing, and that alumni in Denver is doing, and all the other alumni I meet all the time, is really just a shot in the arm to keep doing what I'm doing for current students, so that they enjoy the same kinds of successes that you all have had, and that you all continue to have, to be an inspiration to them. So for me, I've had a lot of great opportunities, and the opportunity to talk with alumni and meet with alumni, tell my story, share my story, see if that can touch someone and help them, including things like this show, is always a very wonderful experience and opportunity that I will happily accept. Because if I can have any positive influence on anyone, I'm happy to do that, because so many people have positive influences on me.
Thank you. And you have such an inspiring story. And I'm hoping that others who watch this, who are maybe minority kids thinking of going to law school or who are not sure where they want to be in the future, but hearing your story will inspire them. Thank you so much for coming on the show and for giving us this time because I know you are very busy, but thank you.
No, thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to more opportunities to talk to you and other alums. And anyone who's interested in going to law school, we're here for you. Capital University Law School is a school of access and opportunity. We were admitting people of color and women as early as our founding in 1903, and we will continue to be a place that gives people opportunities.
Thank you. And for those of you who are watching or listening to us, thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay safe and stay blessed. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.